The history of World War II is full of bloody tragedies, but even among them, the story of Soviet prisoners of war stands out for its drama and the sheer number of victims. In Soviet times, people didn't like to talk about this topic, or if they did, it was presented in a very one-sided way due to state ideology. Meanwhile, during the war, almost 6 million Soviet servicemen ended up in German captivity, and most of them died in captivity. However, the fate of the survivors was not easy either. When they returned home, they faced camps and an indelible stigma for the rest of their lives. Because as Generalissimo Comrade Stalin said, we have no prisoners of war, only traitors. In this episode, I will talk about the difficult fate of Soviet prisoners during World War II. You will learn how many there really were, why they surrendered en masse, and how they lived in German captivity. My name is Semyon and I'm launching the How They Lived series. Let's begin. Why did Red Army soldiers surrender en masse? Subtitles created by Dima Torzok. At the beginning of this video, the number 6 million Soviet prisoners of war was mentioned, but in reality, no one knows how many there actually were. Foreign sources give figures ranging from 5.2 to 5.9 million people. The Russian General Staff claims that 4.56 million Red Army servicemen were taken prisoner by the Germans. Such a huge discrepancy in the numbers points to only one thing. As usual, no one actually counted the people. And the saddest part is that we will most likely never know the exact number of those who were taken prisoner and died there. A total of 1,836,000 people returned home from German, as well as Finnish, Romanian and Hungarian captivity. Approximately another 250,000 Soviet prisoners managed to stay in the West after Germany's capitulation. It turns out that even if we take the minimum estimates of Russian historians, 2.4 million people died in captivity. These are simply colossal numbers. The largest number of Soviet servicemen were captured in 1941. According to German data, their number was 3.8 million people. In the Kiev encirclement alone, Hitler's forces took more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers and officers prisoner. And besides the Kiev encirclement, there were also encirclements in Belarus and disasters near Vyazma and Smolensk. And the following year, 1942, also turned out to be not very successful for the Red Army. In the encirclement near Kharkov, more than 240,000 Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner. Why did Soviet soldiers surrender en masse? The scale of Soviet servicemen surrendering at the beginning of the war was simply unprecedented. Nothing like this had ever happened before in world military history. Entire regiments of the Red Army, along with officers and commanders, switched to the enemy's side. Why did this happen? There are several reasons for this. It is obvious that the Red Army and the Soviet leadership were absolutely unprepared for Germany's attack and a major war with a serious enemy. Despite having a much larger population and outnumbering the enemy in tanks, aviation and artillery, the Soviet troops, due to incompetent leadership, repeatedly found themselves encircled and surrendered. Before the war, the Red Army underwent harsh purges that affected not only the high command, but also mid-level officers. As a result, many capable generals and commanders were executed or sent to camps, which of course seriously weakened the workers' and peasants' Red Army. The low level of training among Soviet officers was clearly demonstrated during the Winter War with the Finns. And here they had to face a much more serious opponent. The repressions created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty in the army, discouraging Red commanders from showing initiative on the battlefield for a long time. However, I see another reason as the main cause for the mass surrender of Soviet soldiers. They simply did not want to fight for a government that had tormented the country for 20 years. The Red Terror, the horrific collectivization, famine, and the repressions of the 1930s, all of this happened literally within the lifetime of a single generation, in just about 20 years. The ones who suffered the most under Soviet rule were the peasants, who made up the backbone of the Red Army. Their situation in the USSR was hardly different from the position of slaves in ancient Rome. It's not surprising that many Red Army soldiers saw the Germans not as enemies, but almost as liberators. The residents of the newly liberated territories, Western Ukraine and Belarus, the Baltics, who had experienced the delights of Soviet rule for 2 years, absolutely did not want to fight for Stalin. All these factors combined and led to a real catastrophe, as a result of which millions of Soviet soldiers and officers ended up in captivity. By autumn, the Germans had reached the Soviet capital. The terrible winter of 1941. By the end of 1941, the Nazis had already captured 500,000 more Soviet soldiers than there were troops in the entire Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. And this became a huge problem for the Germans because Germany itself was already experiencing serious food shortages. And the Nazis had no desire to waste it on the Slavic Untermenschen either. Auschwitz, Dachau, Sachsenhausen. Today, these ominous names are known all over the world, but in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, there were hundreds of Nazi concentration camps where no less terrible crimes were committed and where millions of Soviet citizens were killed, mainly prisoners of war. The first thing the Germans did was to screen the prisoners. Jews and commissars were shot on the spot, while the rest was sent to newly established concentration camps. Most of them were in Ukraine, over 180. The prisoners were forced to march exhausting distances, sometimes 50 to 60 kilometers a day. Those who couldn't keep up were finished off. For example, on the way to one of the camps in the Luhansk region, out of 5,000 prisoners of war, 150 people were shot. On the way, the prisoners were not fed, so they ate anything they could find: berries, wheat ears, mushrooms, leaves, bark, and even grass. The camps for Soviet prisoners in 1941 were very different from the Nazi death camps, which we know well from films and newsreels. They had no permanent buildings, crematoriums, or gas chambers. Often the Nazis would simply fence off an area with barbed wire, set up guard towers, and drive the prisoners inside. Quarries were often used for these purposes. In addition to prisoners of war, these camps also held Jews and Roma, but former servicemen made up the majority here. In such camps, people died en masse from starvation, shootings, disease, and unbearable living conditions. For example, in the Uman pit, prisoners were kept in the open air, with no way to shelter themselves from the heat, wind, or rain. Essentially, the area where the prisoners were held became a massive mass grave. There were so many dead that no one paid any attention to them. The prisoners might not be fed at all, or they were given the bare minimum, clearly not enough to meet a person's basic physiological needs. For example, in the infamous Bagunia camp in Zhytomyr, each prisoner was allotted 100 grams of millet and half a liter of water per day. More than 100,000 prisoners of war died in this camp. In the Donetsky camp, prisoners were given sugar beet leaves. Here, the number of victims also reached into the hundreds of thousands. The attitude of German soldiers towards Soviet prisoners of war was extremely cruel. The main reason was Hitler's propaganda, which spoke about the inferiority of Slavs and directly called on Wehrmacht soldiers to kill prisoners. Any offense in the camp was punishable by execution. You could get shot just for giving a guard a sideways glance.
Иногда заключенных убивали
just for fun. It's no wonder that, because of such inhuman conditions, most Soviet prisoners captured by the German army in 1941 did not survive until the spring of the following year. And here it should be said that this was a strategic mistake by the Nazis. If in 1941 many Red Army soldiers surrendered en masse and many considered the Germans to be liberators, now these illusions had disappeared. There were far fewer people willing to surrender. On the other hand, the resistance of Soviet soldiers at the front grew stronger every day. And yet, if the Germans had behaved a little differently, they could have easily gained millions of motivated fighters who would have gladly gone to war against the communist regime. And in that case, it's unlikely that Stalin and his gang would have survived 1941. That was probably Hitler's only chance to win World War II, but the foolish and narrow-minded fanatic missed that opportunity. Soviet prisoners of war in German concentration camps. Starting from 1942, Soviet prisoners were increasingly transported to concentration camps in Germany and Eastern Europe. The reason was the acute shortage of labor in the Third Reich. Perhaps this is what saved the Soviet prisoners from complete extermination. In the European camps, Soviet prisoners were kept in much worse conditions than soldiers from other countries. The reason was simple. The Soviet Union never signed the Hague Convention and did not join the Geneva Convention, which regulated the legal status of prisoners of war and the conditions of their detention. This gave the Germans a formal reason not to treat Soviet prisoners as military personnel. Discrimination was evident in everything. Soviet prisoners were assigned the hardest work, they were fed worse, and were not given winter clothing. Also, the activities of the International Red Cross did not extend to Soviet prisoners. However, the biggest problem and the main reason for the high mortality rate among the soldiers was lack of food. For example, in the camp at Hammerstein, prisoners received 200 grams of bread per day, ersatz coffee, and a thin vegetable soup. The nutritional value of such a diet did not exceed 1,000 calories. This is not enough even for a person lying still, and yet the prisoners also had to work. The bread for the prisoners had the following composition: 50% rye bran, 20% beet, 20% cellulose, 10% straw. The Germans themselves called this bread Russian. Prisoners who were assigned to work were given an additional food ration, but even here they cut corners wherever they could. For example, in one of the orders from the director of the German concern IG Farben Industry, it was stated that increasing the productivity of prisoners of war could be achieved by reducing their food rations. It is clear that such conditions led to a high mortality rate among prisoners of war. In Poland alone, more than 800,000 prisoners from the USSR are buried. Moreover, it was not only hunger and disease that killed the prisoners. The most inhumane experiments were conducted on the inmates. For example, the infamous Zyklon B gas was first tested on Soviet prisoners of war. In the Dachau concentration camp, German doctors conducted experiments on prisoners of war involving hypothermia and frostbite and tested the effects of high altitudes on the human body. New medicines were tested on Soviet prisoners. Their survival time without water and food was determined, and experimental surgical operations were performed. They were injected with toxic substances and poisons. If we talk about the number of victims of such experiments, it is relatively small. However, carrying out these experiments clearly shows the true attitude of the Nazis towards Soviet prisoners. They simply weren't considered human. What awaited Soviet prisoners of war at home? Captivity is a harsh ordeal for anyone. However, the suffering of Soviet prisoners of war did not end even after returning to their homeland. After all, they immediately fell under suspicion of treason, and in the USSR that was no joke. Moreover, even a brief stay of a Soviet citizen behind enemy lines attracted the attention of the relevant authorities, which could end badly for him, and not just for him. In all personnel questionnaires in the USSR, even decades after the war, there was a question: were any of your relatives in occupied territory? A positive answer to this question created serious problems for the person. However, let's get back to the prisoners of war. According to the Soviet Criminal Code, surrendering as a serviceman, if it was not caused by the combat situation, was punishable by execution and confiscation of property. Such vagueness in the wording gave the punitive authorities wide scope for abuse. If desired, anyone could be sentenced to the death penalty. In general, any person who had been in captivity was regarded by the Soviet authorities as a traitor to the motherland. All Soviet servicemen who returned from captivity were sent to filtration camps, where they were screened. Out of 1.8 million prisoners who returned to the USSR, according to official data, more than 230,000 people were sentenced to various prison terms. Not only prisoners of war ended up in filtration camps, but also those who had been encircled and managed to make it back to their own lines. They were held there as prisoners under guard and behind barbed wire. They were even taken out for forced labor. The conditions were such that many thousands of people died in these camps. Special assault battalions were formed for former prisoners of war even during the war, which in essence were no different from penal units. It's true that the stay there was limited to 2 months, but getting out alive was simply unrealistic. In other words, people were sent almost to certain death just because they had been in captivity. Up until the late 1950s, being in captivity barred people from respectable professions and ruined their careers. It was only under Khrushchev that they stopped reproaching former prisoners for their past. Prisoners in the service of the Third Reich. According to historians' estimates, during the war, Nazi Germany fought with between 1.24 and 1.5 million Soviet citizens. Among them were many captured servicemen who chose to cooperate with the enemy for a variety of reasons. For some, it was the only chance to save their lives in the camp, while others sincerely hated the communist regime and wanted to fight against it, even if it meant joining the army of the occupiers. Researchers cite different numbers, but it is clear that we are talking about hundreds of thousands of people. The Germans usually used units formed from former Soviet citizens for guard and sentry duties. They often took part in punitive operations against partisans and civilians. After the war ended, all collaborators who were found received serious prison sentences. Many of them were executed. Instead of an epilogue, the story of Soviet prisoners of war is one of the most tragic chapters of the Second World War. And it's not just about the huge number of victims, but also about the attitude of the state toward its citizens who managed to survive captivity. For the rest of their lives, they had to keep explaining themselves, even though most of these people ended up in the terrible Nazi captivity through no fault of their own. Well, that's all from me. See you in the next episode. Bye!